Hi, and welcome back. My name is Jeffrey, and I'm talking to Sylvia again, and we're going to be discussing on virtues, one of the chapters of Plotinus. How are you today, Sylvia?
I'm pretty good. I got my hair cut. It's
Very
even
good.
more orange now.
Very nice. Very nice. So today we're going to discuss virtue. So I want to start by asking you, how do you understand the word virtue, and what does it mean to you?
What does it mean to me before I read Plotinus?
Before
Or
you read Plotinus, and in your general consensus and life, what does
okay.
virtue mean? What does it mean to be a virtuous person?
I guess I mean, not that this necessarily does not align with it, but I was coming from it maybe from a more of a Roman value system, more of the idea of Romanitas and the various Roman values. So I guess virtue to me is someone I think it somewhat aligns on a more practical, everyday level with what some of the things Plotinus says. To me, it means someone who does not act based on just selfish and impulsive desires and needs. It's someone who acts in accordance with, I guess, some rules that have been set out by society, but insofar as those rules are meant to keep a level of stability that is beneficial for the society as a whole and for the individual and at the family level. I think some of the virtues that I think are most important are number one for me is the virtue of one's word. I think for me, it really boils down to someone that is trustworthy and will follow through with what they have presented of themselves and will
Mhm.
make the choice that is not conniving or very selfish and is not easily swayed by their emotions. And I think after reading this, a lot of those kinds of things, which I think can be seen in most human societies, are definitely reflected also on the what he calls the civic virtues
Mhm.
with Plotinus. And I think he gives us more of like an explanation of like the origins of what virtues are more than giving us a different list of virtues for the material world.
Mhm. Mhm.
What about you? I know you're coming from, I mean, I know you also follow some Roman things, but you also come from a Buddhist and Eastern mentality toward virtues.
Well, I tend to think of virtue maybe in a similar way to Plotinus, that there is civic virtues, which maybe I would qualify as social virtues. And these are, the basic rules of society that are there to arrange society in such a way to optimize the general everyday functions and activities of life. So no stealing, no cheating, holding, true to your word, um, trustworthiness, not the principle of not harming other people unduly. I mean, of course, there are instances where force and aggression are warranted when you are, for example, facing injustice or danger, that sort of thing. So I think there are civic social virtues. And then I think at a higher level, maybe this aligns also with Plotinus, I believe that in the absence of desire or passions, I would say, using the Stoic term, the passions, using the Buddhist terminology, the kleshas, in the absence of these so-called mental afflictions, then people tend to be rather amicable, even docile in a way. But if you are governed by reason, then I think a lot of our mammalian instincts are also, to a large extent, tamed, and also they won't direct our actions and our mind in a way that is detrimental, not just to ourselves, but also toward others. So it's not that somebody who is governed by reason will be, Machiavellian and self-interested, but actually it's the opposite. I think in the absence of these passions, then a person will naturally want to do what's in the interests of their community, because it's also in their best self-interest as well. And the concept of morality, I should say, is something that I've kind of grappled with for years. Not that I've done immoral things or that I've done things that I regret. It's just the concept of morality itself, because in the absence of a belief in like a divine punishment, like a judge in the afterlife, then really what is to stop you from living a very Machiavellian, self-interested life? Like, why not just cheat, lie, steal, and get what you want, and then you can enjoy material pleasures as much as you want?
Well, because those aren't very fulfilling, though, are they, really, at the end of the day? I think you don't need someone to punish you for you to eventually find that you're punishing yourself by limiting yourself to these things, which do not fill destiny or need man has. I definitely found that in my own life. Not that I'm an arch villain, but you as you become wiser, you realize that many of these things that society or external influences persuade you or allude you to thinking are important, in fact, are not important and are not the things that are sustainably filling you in any sort of meaningful way.
Right. And my conclusion is also that it's actually in your best self-interest long term to be a good, honest, straightforward, helpful person, because to live a so-called Machiavellian life where you lie, cheat, and steal your way to the top is ultimately against your self-interests, because eventually your community picks up on that, and then you have to face the prospect of betrayal, retribution, that sort of thing. There's a saying from the Ming Dynasty, a Chinese author, who says that the virtuous are lonely for a short time, but those who scheme for power and glory are lonely all the time. And so I think that kind of reflects into this discussion we're having. So anyways,
Definitely.
moving on to Plotinus. So we're looking at chapter 1, section 2 on virtues. So what's your general assessment outline of this chapter?
I guess he kind of explains that there are two levels of virtues, the ones that he calls the civic virtues, in which he lists a few examples, which we would recognize as being some of the things even you and I just kind of material in this world, behavioral, I guess I would say. And then he speaks to another level of virtues, which is in the intelligible world. And I was having a little bit of difficulty in understanding what exactly he meant by that, but my understanding, which may very well be incorrect, was that in the intelligible world, the things that we might call virtues are not really virtues in the way we understand virtues. It's just the natural order or the natural dynamic of things. It's just their nature. But once aspects of those things emanate down into the material world and are reflected here, and we can pick up on the impressions and choose to act in alignment with them in the material world, they become virtues, because the reason that the reason, capital R reason, that flows from the intelligible world into that which is the chaotic material world, because he says that the material realm, material is actually immaterial. It doesn't have a fixed form. It doesn't have a fixed pattern or meaning. It's basically chaos, is how I understood that. And also he references Plato and the Theaetetus, and I went back and read that, basically that this realm is somewhat, I wouldn't say morally, but let's just use the term evil, in the fact that it's really more of this this juxtaposition between reason and order and chaos. And that when anyways, when we pick up on this, the dynamic that flows down from the higher levels, and we act upon it, we act in accordance with those forms or dynamics or the intelligible that we see, we are acting in a virtuous manner, or at least we are acting toward a virtuous manner. And a lot of that has to do with exactly, acting in accordance with what's rational and not what is impulsive, or feeding into our passions, desires, fears, anger, these kinds of things. So as you said earlier, I guess it would be kind of when we are able to divorce ourselves from these kinds of impulsive reptilian part of the brain reactions and act on reason, we are being more virtuous. he also talks about this whole process of, well, he also talks about how these two virtues are intrinsically tied and that there is a process of purification in which you can become virtuous. Plato gives an example in the Theaetetus, which I think he's building on, of 3 levels toward becoming virtuous. He speaks of the musician, the lover, and the philosopher. Basically, the musician is someone who, loves music, loves the harmony of that, but kind of teaching them to see that beauty of order in other things. And once they've reached that, he speaks of the lover as, I see it kind of like as a similar example, but maybe I'm misunderstanding it. The lover, I think he means like a carnal lover who loves a body, but once he sees beauty in all bodies, that the beauty in anybody or any form, it's really the same beauty because it's the form of beauty as it reflects down into all forms is identical. So then he can learn to divorce himself from loving the material aspect and realizing what he's really loving is this immaterial thing. And Plato suggests that a way to get the lover to a higher level toward virtue is maybe presenting him or her with other forms of beauty that exist in culture, such as customs, rituals, because it kind of teaches them like immaterial beauty. It's not just a visceral thing to get them used to understanding beauty in a more immaterial, abstract way. And then the final level is, or not the final level, but the final level before you can really start purifying yourself is what he calls the philosopher, which is the person who understands all these kinds of things. Like rationally, he conceptually understands this and he wants this, but he needs a guide to help him reach the level to truly understand the intelligible world and be purified. And in this book, Plotinus is not, he just references it, but he points out this level of purification you have to reach to become truly virtuous. And he speaks, I believe, to becoming more like God and, his definition of God, which sometimes it's a little unclear if he's just talking about the intelligible realm or if he's talking about the one. I don't think it's that important, but clearly he intends a higher plane than where we're at.
Right. He uses the word assimilation in the English translation. So to assimilate into this higher state, but that higher state is actually the reality. So the intelligible is actually reality. And that's why he also says that virtue doesn't exist at the level of the intellect, but rather it is at the level of the soul, because to want to be virtuous is in effect an impulse, a movement, whereas that wouldn't be applicable at the level of the intellect.
Okay, that clears up a lot for me. So so virtue can only exist at the level of the soul, which is, our higher self, even in this material world, as we and you sit here. And that it's that desire, the much like the soul is a creative desire to create material, the inverse kind of virtue is the soul's desire to move toward back up the emanation hierarchy toward the intelligible, etc., and the one, I guess, as well. So virtue is that desire to go back to what reality is, or what should be the norm, the correct way. Those are my words, but that makes a lot of sense. That clears up a lot. So that, and that explains why it's not like there's virtue in the intelligible world. That it is what it is. To want to go back to that level is the virtue.
And that's
for mortals.
That's why God cannot possess virtues either. Because God, if you want to qualify the intelligible reality as being God, then it would not possess virtues.
Correct, because God, unlike us, when we even give examples of virtues, it's always like us trying to abstain or control ourselves from temptation or impulses that exist in this material world. Obviously, a god or the gods don't need to do that because they're not living in the situation that man is, or any other moderately or highly intelligent being that may also exist in the material realm.
This also brings to mind the stark difference in this case between Plotinus's conception of God or gods and what you find in the Greek myths, where, for
Oh,
example,
yes.
Zeus is lusting after, women, and you have Mars or Ares as a war god,
Well, I mean, Plotinus obviously is a pupil of Plato, and Plato did not have very warm and fuzzy feelings toward the poets of his age. And I think, I mean, there's different opinions on that. There's people, and I kind of tend to agree with this. I don't think that he was necessarily totally against poetry, but the way in which it was practiced, how the arts were practiced, I mean, he thought they were both untruthful, dangerous to society, and heretical. And I think he's definitely talking about the Homerian legacy of representation of the gods, which reading this and kind of thinking of the gods not as just mythological tales from a kind of atheistic point of view, but actually looking at it theologically and morally, it does seem heretical. It makes very little sense, really. I understand. I mean, we all understand why they exist, because humans like to tell tales to explain themselves, and I'm sure there's all sorts of other historical, anthropological reasons that may also reflect, stories get mixed in time. There may very well be aspects of gods that are tied up with ancient rulers we don't even know about, or that it's unclear. But yes, he definitely saw it as untrue and bad, because what message is that giving to society if the gods are behaving in this way? And if the gods are the way they were behaving was as if the gods were in the material realm.
right.
And that's not good. I mean, that is not one, it was seen as false. Two, it's kind of hopeless in a sense, if you think about it, because if they behave the same way and they're existing in a realm where things morally function as they do here, there isn't much hope for anything better. But then again, the ancient Greeks were also rather negative and pessimistic, and I see why.
Well, I mean, I would see it also from a historical angle, stepping away from the philosophy, and see that obviously the Greeks inherited the myths of their ancestors.
Yeah.
And, the poets, the society, the theater obviously didn't do away with that. But then you have more theologically refined philosophy taking on the questions of what is the divine and how do we assimilate ourselves to it. And so once you get to that level, then these sort of myths really become, in a lot of ways, almost impossible to accept literally. And I think at this level of, refined philosophy and theology, then you don't really accept the myths, except for them just being stories of the past, and
Right.
trying to make sense of them through the lens of Neoplatonic philosophy, for example, would be very challenging, as you said. So, but that being said, too, it's not that you have to throw away everything. But
I think the purpose, I think one just has to reframe the way they see the the Homeric mythologies. And I think that archaeologically and historically, people, at least have, because like you said, these stories, or even if you want to look at it religiously or metaphysically or spiritually, if the gods or those things that are above us first started interacting or making themselves known to early man, or early man started picking up on it, I personally think it's like any relationship, a slow evolution. You don't get to know somebody immediately, it takes time. So early man first started picking up on aspects of this and putting it in a context that they could understand. And then over hundreds of years, as is the nature of people, you start adding and all sorts of complex aspects of political situations, circumstances. People start adding other stories that are actually just the stories of real humans on Earth, overlaid onto these gods, because leaders, etc., want to deify themselves. Then there's also the aspect of pure entertainment. There's the aspect of wanting to use a poster child of the gods as like these universals to tell stories about the human condition. And then one conflates what would be the true divine condition with the human condition. So I see it as it being useful in storytelling of the human condition, but it not being any sort of truth about the metaphysical realm or the true nature of the gods.
Hmm. Hmm. There's also an evolution over time where at a certain early stage, there's not necessarily a sense that there's something wrong with our world and with our state. There's just reality as we experience it, and then you can overlay these myths on it. But then once you get to a certain stage, you get a concept of what we would call soteriology, that there's some sort of problem with reality, and there ought to be an exit or an escape. So in the case of this chapter that we're reading, there's this idea of assimilation to the divine. So you're going from being an ordinary person filled with passions and vices and destructive tendencies to being somebody who is virtuous, not just in a civic sense, but also in a sort of wiser, higher philosophical sense. But that implies that there's something wrong, inherently wrong or disagreeable with being the ordinary person. Whereas at an earlier stage, a sort of earlier polytheism, there's not a sense that there's something wrong with the world.
Well, we have to also remember, we've all of this feels so distant from us, but we got to remember how much time has elapsed between the Homer or whomever the Homeric poets were and Plato, and in this case, Plotinus. Plotinus is what, 2 AD? It is like right after peak crisis time in the Western world. It's after or basically, I mean, yeah, different ideas of when the Roman Empire actually fell, but it is in steep decline. Christianity is already in the play. People are having all sorts of political, financial, and existential turmoil on a massive scale. The Homeric stories are from the Bronze Age, and Plato is from after the Bronze Age, and we have to kind of think of like what the political climate and just the safety and scarcity level of the situation for the people were in the respective areas in which these three groups of people we're talking about live. So yes, definitely, like the idea of life and what we can fathom from early Bronze Age to basically early Christianity, very different. People very much like we've gone through after the Enlightenment, an era of disillusionment, disenchantment. I think not that it's apples to apples, but I definitely think that after the collapse of the Bronze Age and then further the decline of the Roman Empire, major disenchantment with the metaphysics that people perceive, but also general discontent and fear. I mean, when we look at some of the polytheistic religions of the Mediterranean era, Mediterranean region, the idea of the golden age that pre-existed most likely was early Bronze Age or before, and that decline could arguably be tied to the real world collapse of the Bronze Age, which is also rather intriguing in the various aspects that we think may have played into that, and players that we're not even sure who they were and how it caused, and the major climactic and environmental factors that played into that as well.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, definitely, your situation is definitely going to color the way you perceive things, which is also why I personally think that the religions of a place like the Italic Peninsula and the religions of the Middle East are so different. And there's more of a salvation factor in places that are much harsher to live in versus a fertile and abundant area like central Italy. That again is just my pondering on this. But
Right. I think it's also one other point is, so by the time of Plotinus's age too, there was a lot of competition with philosophy, and so there was the Platonists competing with the Epicureans, competing with the Stoics and the Christians, and so there were
the Gnostics.
The Gnostics, and so there was a lot of competition. Yeah. So maybe at a certain level too, that the schools wanted to position themselves in a way that was, most, maybe not marketable, that's not the right word, but the most agreeable, understandable, being able to deliver the most practical message and package of practices and wisdom that they could provide. Because in this sort of context too, there's people will define their own positions also based on what they're not. And so it's very clear who is a Stoic and who is a Platonist, for example. And it's not that they can't overlap, and in fact they do. And in fact they can borrow from each other as well, but there's still, dogmatic lines that are also drawn
Right.
as well.
I would further say that the fact that there were so many competing philosophies or even theologies at the time, that society was starting to break down, that there was no longer a cohesive one religion, one virtue system. It wasn't, for a myriad of reasons, those things weren't working anymore, and people were looking elsewhere to figure out how to navigate their life. And I think you can see that reflected, I think, in a smaller way, but in today's society versus, I don't know, at this point, like 70 years ago, people have very different, not even, they have very different ideas of what even virtue, or since we're talking about virtue, but what morality even is, or what is right or wrong, or very much even the nature of reality on this plane is in question between different factions. And I think it is because this has happened because the way things were stopped working for a myriad of reasons, and things then start, getting fractioned.
That's a good observation. I think it's valid, especially even in our lifetimes. We've probably witnessed, for example, the decline of church attendance in, you're from Italy, I'm from Canada. When I was growing up, a lot more families went to church than now. And Christianity, where I grew up in Winnipeg, was basically the predominant philosophy, religion, lifestyle for people. And it was expected as well until the 1990s, and then everything changed. And now you have people seeking a message, even an ideology, but there's a tendency to dismiss traditional religion, organized religion, in favor of either something that is from a foreign country or something that you design yourself. So whether it be self-help or what people call spirituality, how spirituality is different from religion is a whole other discussion. Many people will say I'm spiritual, not religious. I think usually what they mean is that I have my own beliefs that are not, in line with materialist science, but I don't want to follow an organized religion with doctrines and dogmas. I want to believe what I want to believe, and I don't have to justify it in some sort of, theological way or some sort of, intellectual way.
I think in the last 10, 15 years, though, things are moving much faster in the era we live in versus pretty much any other era, and they've been moving quicker and quicker. Even if you look at a map of different epochs of human history, you'll see how each epoch, even like the Middle Ages and the Renaissance and the Enlightenment versus the Bronze Age and the Paleolithic age, they just get shorter and shorter as technology evolves, as communication evolves. We just keep going faster and faster. And I say that to say that as much as what you said is totally true, at the same time, I think in the last 10 to 15 years, 10 years maybe, this has been more of an observation on my part. There's also been already a reaction, I don't want to say reactionary negatively, but just kind of a reactionary movement where there's also young people who, versus maybe in the 70s and 80s where young people were less interested in becoming religious. Now there's also a reactionary movement of people returning to modern traditional religions like Christianity. And then there's also people who are reaching out and becoming and revitalizing and reconstructing ancient religions, right?
Right.
It's all over the place. And then there's people who completely deny anything, total atheistic materialism, but on a material and, this is my opinion, material and sociological, political level, have almost deified certain political ideologies in which it is for them, knowingly or unknowingly, fulfilling the void that previously was filled by religious doctrine and practices. So it's all over the place right now.
I remember when the New Atheist movement in the 2000s was really powerful, and on my university campus, we had some prominent speakers of the New Atheist movement fly in and give lectures, and it was a very sort of almost belligerent position that they took towards religion. They would just stand there and, badmouth the Bible and say it's all just superstitious nonsense. And they weren't actually engaging with the theologians and with the people who were sympathetic to Christianity, for example. But that movement seems to have, in large part, actually petered out. It doesn't seem to have the same sort
Yeah.
of persuasiveness and power that it had before. And now we're kind of, as you say, at a point where there's some people who are actually returning to church, and then there's another set of people who are very much interested in, you know, revivalism or some sort of spirituality. I think like the proliferation in particular of astrology in the last 10 to 20 years can be explained by this as well. I mean, one factor is also just the ease in which people can practice astrology, because the software for calculating charts is available in the internet, and translations and so forth, and online classes have really allowed people to study it. But I sense that, particularly at least in the English speaking world, but I would say probably it extends outside the English speaking world, that people who practice astrology are interested in investigating fate, and through investigating fate using astrology, you're also engaging in a sort of spirituality at the same time.
Absolutely. You cannot, I don't think you can believe in astrology and not believe that there is something beyond the materialistic atheist world, unless you have some kind of backward, superstitious, scientifically incorrect understanding of astrology as being influences versus reflection of if you know what I mean.
I guess if you took Claudius Ptolemy's position, then it's a natural science, and just as the moon has influence on the tide, so does the planets have infect.
But I think most astrologers today do not follow that mentality.
Often these days I see it framed as energy. They usually use the word energy, like there's Martian or Venusian energies at work. But
is it really that those things are causing? They're not the causality of the things happening in one's life or in events. It's a reflection. It's like a divine reflection of the events. Almost like if you are able to decipher, you are able to look into the future or the past in the stars. Because, I mean, if we want to tie it back to Plotinus, and this is me speaking, or his idea of cosmology, we are perceiving them linearly, but they are really all happening at the same time or outside of time. And there are things that exist in the order that has been created, where these things are reflected on the micro and the macro.
Well, yeah, in Hellenistic astrology, the predominant view was that the planets signal phase rather than being the causal agents.
Correct. Yeah, that's what I'm speaking to.
Right. And Claudius Ptolemy, who wrote the Tetrabiblos, frames it as basically a natural science where there's like Mars is not a divinity or an intelligence that signals things, but rather it's a force on the earth.
At what time was he writing? Do you remember?
So Ptolemy is 2nd century Common Era.
Yeah, so this is just me based on what you just told me, but I would not be surprised if he was trying to frame it more as a natural science to be able to continue to, and he very well may have totally believed it, but to reconcile other, pressures on him socially, politically, that if you continue to see this from a more purely metaphysical or divine place, it was probably coming into conflict with other religious ideas that were coming into place, such as Christianity and political figures who probably were not a fan. But if you frame it much later during the Renaissance and the Middle Ages, where magic was like, natural magic is fine, because it was basically perceived as just like a science, what we would call today like science or the beginnings of empiricism. It's the world as it is here. It's not man trying to actually meddle with, things at the level of God. So I wonder if maybe that in general, he and other people of that era were moving toward that mentality, just because it would allow astrology to continue to survive in an era where it would not be accepted if it wasn't just seen as like, oh, this is just a natural influence. It's just kind of what we would call, it's just science. I'm not saying that it's the gods or that it's the order of a higher level being, because that might get you into trouble.
Ptolemy became really popular long after he passed away.
Yeah.
It doesn't seem he made much of an impression in his own day, but we don't really know the context.
But it makes sense that he became popular later on in the era.
In particular, during the era of monotheistic religion.
Yes.
In the Middle East and Europe, where you don't have to frame it as planets as gods, but rather planets as natural forces. So so rather than saying there is a solar god and a Martian god, which is basically polytheistic, you say it's natural forces. So it's no different.
It just lowers everything down to just nature and part of the nature that God created.
Right. It's sort of
their
like
God created.
Yeah, it's like anti-deification, de-deification, where you strip it of its divinity.
Well, we live in an era of deification.
Exactly. And in this era of disenchantment, using the conventional terminology, I think a lot of people, in particular in our generation, are seeking something in order to structure their lives and to see reality in a way that's fulfilling, because the materialist worldview, where we're basically just a society of cells, which is a society of molecules and atoms that really has no meaning, then it's ultimately it's meaningless, but it's also, you have to find your own meaning.
It's completely subjective, and so then it's everything. Like, it creates a relative morality, with the only kind of caveat being, maybe if you want to look at it from like, the only morality is that which is controlled by that which causes physical suffering in a biological entity. You want to avoid that, but that's like about the extent of that. But I believe personally, and going back to bringing it full circle, like, it's not working out, because as much as man may want to fight it, we are spiritual beings. And so we're trying, even when we don't recognize it, we are searching for something. And I think that brings back to the virtues, where to be virtuous is to reconnect, to assimilate to our spiritual nature, which is in the intelligible realm.
Right, which is to be also governed by reason,
and
assimilate to the divine, which is a process in itself. But if you follow this process, and it's by no means easy, then the outcome of that is something that's subjectively more fulfilling, but at the same time too, it is a process and a journey. So it's also a sort of story. And so humans have a tendency to frame their lives as stories. And if you want to go on this path of purification, then you're, nominally starting out as an ordinary person with vices and evil in your life, which maybe you bring onto yourself, and you bring onto others. And then it's a process also of gradually working towards being a virtuous person.
So does he actually cover in this chapter I read it kind of last week, and I kind of re-looked at it yesterday, but any detail on how to purify yourself, the process of purification? Or is it more just, I guess it's following the virtues, but he also says that the higher virtues, I guess, precede it. Does he really give any indication at this point in the book on how to move forward and trying to assimilate and to purify yourself?
In the last paragraph, he says, should we state at least that the virtuous person will know them and how much he will have of them? Perhaps he will act according to some of them if circumstances demand, but advancing on to the greater principles and the other measures, he will act according to those. For example, he will not locate the act of self-control in imposing a measure, but in separating himself entirely as far as possible, absolutely not living the life of the good human being, which civic virtue values, but leaving this and opting for another, the life of the gods. And so he's taking this, he's suggesting that the truly virtuous person is taking a step beyond the civic virtues.
Right.
This is almost kind of like it's almost like a encouragement to almost live a monastic life, and maybe some people would actually understand it like that as well. So
yeah, I highlighted that whole section. Yeah, for assimilation is to the gods, not to good human beings. So, which I thought was also funny for another reason, because I think he's kind of throwing shade at virtue signaling here. I don't know if you picked up on that, but he is, because he makes a differentiation that really becoming virtuous and moving toward purifying yourself is not to act as a reflection of good human civic virtues, which is what virtue signaling is when you're not even actually a good person. You're just, miming those behaviors so that it's seen socially. He's talking about trying to reflect or trying to mimic the way of the gods. Don't try to mimic what is socially, like what is civically virtuous or civically just or proper, but take it to a whole, you should already be that in reality, like honestly and genuinely, and therefore take it to the next level where you are at least attempting to mimic, or not mimic as in a pretend acting, but truly try to, I use the term mimic because I think it is very difficult for man to be like the gods, but at least attempt to behave, or what would the, I guess to use a very cliche Christian saying, what would the gods do? How would the gods act? What and more importantly, what aspects of the world and reality we live in are completely absent to the gods, or and that we can divorce ourselves from?
What comes to mind here is the idea that the intelligible realm is reality, and by virtue of that, it's truth. And so the more you orient yourself toward true reality, the more oriented you will be toward truth. And if your body, speech, and mind are oriented toward truth, then inevitably, out of necessity too, you will orient yourself toward virtue. So just, you will naturally, without really ever thinking about it, just refrain from lying, just as an example, because lying is anti-truth.
Right. I think for a human, it's mostly like a negative practice in the sense that, since if you're starting off, it is so hard to even conceive or know what the intelligible realm consists of. But you can kind of figure out what it does not consist of, right? All those lower level desires, impulses, and fundamentally suffering and negative aspects of what we experience here. As we start removing those, all you're left with, even if you don't know what you'll be left with, eventually you'll see it, right? So for anybody who's trying to be like, okay, how can I actually put this into any sort of practice? What are you telling me to do here? It's start off by discerning what is not a part of the intelligible, what is here, and what is not what the gods would do. Don't do those things. Like truly, first, just through behavior, and this is like psychological mechanism. Even if you don't truly believe it yet, or like it's not as genuine to you, just behaviorally remove those things from your life, and it will rewire your brain in the material world to allow you to be more open to live in a more virtuous way and be more than connected.
Fake it till you make it.
Yeah, I mean that stuff really works though. Prepare your body in this world through the neurological rewiring to be able to be open to the higher realms of reality, which is reality. I think that's a feasible technique. The purpose here isn't just to read a book and talk about it. The purpose here, at least for me, and clearly you in your life, you're way ahead of me, is to live a virtuous life and to live a life with as little suffering and as much truth and wisdom as possible.
Right. And I think the natural outcome of having this impulse in your soul toward virtue, as you say, will allow for you to orient your life, arrange your life in such a way that you will minimize self-destructive tendencies and harmful tendencies that you have toward others
and yourself.
Right. I mean, just as an example, like if you're also just aware of your own internal vices, like for example, just as a simple, like I will lie in order to get a free lunch. Like for example, just as an example, you go to a hotel and you see there's a conference venue going on and they have a big sandwich table, and all you have to do is just go to the sandwich table and nod and say like, I'm with the conference and you can get a free lunch. Now it's easy enough to do that.
Is that what half the attendance at the conferences you go to are? Just random people wandering in and wanting sandwiches and
stealing sandwiches and coffee.
Come listen to my talk on Buddhism. There's free sandwiches.
But if you do that, like, well, I didn't pay for these and I'm not attending the conference.
It's deception, and therefore it's an untruth.
And you're actually running contrary to truth. Right. And I mean, you could take this out of context and you say, what if you're starving to death? Well, that's a different situation, because in a life or death situation, we're not talking about, for example, survival mode or being a spy where you have to commit deception in order to achieve your mission objectives. But we're talking about mainstream society, where
Right.
we're not in a constant state of conflict and turmoil.
Because in the situation that you're describing versus someone that has been put in such a dire circumstance where they don't have very many options and they are starving, the situation you're describing is the result is deception, therefore untruth. But the probably the reason you're doing it is some petty impulse, right? It's just giving into some petty impulse of
I don't want to
just
spend $10 on my own
mischievousness or late,
sandwiches.
yeah, of just
Right.
like of miserliness or laziness.
It's basically an acknowledgement, not acknowledgement. It's a concession to yourself that I would rather steal the sandwiches from the conference venue than to spend $10, and it's better to save $10 on sandwiches, and that's the decision you make.
It's also
Whereas,
coming from a place of selfishness and also positioning yourself as separate from or not having to follow the same rules as everybody else, kind of positioning yourself in a egotistical manner as above others in kind of like a petty situation. But that's fundamentally what you're doing, where you're exempting yourself from the rules.
and it's also a concession that the truth is less important than the free sandwiches.
Exactly.
Whereas if you're virtuous, you'll admit to yourself that I would rather not be a thief.
Right. Versus someone who's starving, it's like the truth is in this moment less important than me dying. So I'm just saying, like, even though there is a factor of lie in both of deception in both cases, the causality is definitely a more legitimate in one and completely illegitimate in the other one.
Right.
Because the means, or not the means, but the motives are also, I think, important.
Well, it's like, well, if you steal the sandwiches and give them to your children who are hungry as a last resort, then
Right.
that's one instance. I mean, it's even forgivable. But I think one could also make the argument that in most societies that you don't have to get to that point. And if you're
of course not. This is just a silly example.
It's a theoretical example.
Yeah, this is theoretical. There's all sorts of ways to get food. There's
right.
At least in the first world.
Right. I mean, even the Greek philosophers, they pointed out these sort of, extremes as well, like, Socrates in the Republic. He's always pointing out, like, what if?
Theoretical as an extreme, just to like kind of be able to look at why one thing is bad, even if it's a small act. And you were trying,
Right. Like I remember once I was with my friend and we were walking into a McDonald's and I watched this guy fish a receipt out of the trash bin. And then he went up to the counter and he complained to the manager that the meal he got was terrible and he threw it in the trash. And so the manager said sorry, and then he made him a fresh, tray of food. And then this man walked away with his tray of food.
I would say that his deception.
That's deception, and he made the decision. He made the decision.
But I would say that I'm making a lot of assumptions here, but I'm going to do it anyways. The fact that he was someone that was fishing a receipt out of a Burger King, you said, or McDonald's?
McDonald's, yeah.
Out of a McDonald's, which is deceptive, which indicates his like behavior in general, also indicates how he got into the kind of situation in his life probably to begin with, is by being someone who gave into impulse. I mean, even if you're born into a situation that is difficult, it is your choice then to raise yourself above it or not. His choice to probably give into impulses of, I don't know, all sorts of things, impulses, laziness, no discipline. I'm saying I'm putting a lot on this person. I don't even know, but I'm just using him as an example of possibilities of why he would even be there to begin with, pulling something like that. Because it's a cyclical, it's a circular situation where
I guess this leads to the question. Right. This leads to the question, though, is like, well, if you're a virtuous person and you remain poor, then is it worth it? But
I think virtuous people who remain poor are still happier people than unvirtuous people who are poor. You can see that in society. Look at a lot of like the poor people in areas look at parts of society where there is like use of very serious drugs like meth, crack, oxy, stuff like that. The drug addicted people, or a lot of violence, a lot of like no control over family dynamics, versus, and that's poverty versus other parts of the world where someone, or even in the same parts of the world where someone may be poor, but continues to at least have a job, has maybe a family, they're getting by just enough
Mhm.
to survive, but they're spiritually doing better because they are happy with each
Right.
other. They're happy
Peace
with
of
their
mind.
self and their identity.
Hmm.
Um, Still very different. I still think that the person who is virtuous and remains poor is still leading a rewarding life. And will probably, because as a human, like your context is what you know. And being virtuous also means that you're not constantly envying others or comparing yourself to others in a way that is destructive. That person at the end of life will probably look back upon their life if things have, if they have had a good relationship with their family and the people they care about and have been able to take care of themselves and think they had a good life, I think, versus someone, as we described, who may not even, who may die of an overdose or whatever, they're not gonna, or decline, their health declines to such a degree that they are in great suffering near the end of their life, which will probably be cut short by a decade or so. I mean, of course, these
Right.
are examples, but even there, I think being virtuous does make a significant difference because our perception of things is
I think,
everything.
right. I also think, though, in society today, that if you are a good person and you're virtuous, then inevitably, not in all circumstances, but inevitably, you'll probably enjoy prosperity because you'll have a
Yes,
reputation as being a reliable, honest, hardworking person. And
you can
not
choose to elevate yourself.
you can choose to elevate yourself. And it's also in the absence of vices, you're not going to be misspending your money on alcohol
Yes,
and drugs, for
absolutely.
example. And
Or bad, or making bad like choices of what you're eating and treating your body and ending up
right,
with all sorts of diseases, which are very much caused by the
right.
environment that has been presented to us, and unfortunately, most people unwittingly give into.
Diseases of affluence, that's the big problem
Or
today.
diseases of poverty as well. I mean, I guess affluence in relation to into past eras, but I would say definitely wealthy people do not eat like the poor. But they've also been educated to be like, but yeah, definitely. Like, even if you are poor, if you are a virtuous person, you can choose to elevate yourself. Or if you're really that virtuous, I know plenty of people like more like in the countryside, like they don't need a lot, they don't want it, they're totally happy. Because
Hmm.
if you're really trying to reach a level of enlightenment as presented by Plotinus, you don't really need that much. You just need to be healthy, have sustenance, have shelter, and have relations with others that are good and virtuous.
Hmm.
So
The Stoics would even argue that you don't even need physical health in order to be
yeah, well, they're a little
happy.
extra.
You
I know you're
daimonia,
a fan. I'm not a fan of them. They're
you're
a
not a
little,
fan.
I mean, I don't dislike them, but they're not the table that I would sit at lunch with because they're a drag a little bit. I'd sit at the other table. I'd sit with the Epicureans probably,
I
even if
see.
I would not agree with them at this point in my life. At least they're more fun.
Right, right. So, to kind of wrap this up,
Hmm.
um, I'll just read the last sentences again. Assimilation to good human beings is making an image of an image, one from another. But the other assimilation is like making an image according to a paradigm. So my understanding of this would be that there's the civic virtues, which is making an image of an image. So you're basically emulating good human behaviors. But then but the other assimilation, which is becoming godlike, which is assimilating to the gods, to the divine, is like making an image according to a paradigm. So that's not actually making a
Right.
copy of a copy, but rather making yourself a reflection of the actual original paradigm, the original model, the idea. And so this is, I guess, one of the key points of this chapter is actually
Yeah.
the last, I think it's the last two sentences
Hmm.
where
Or
there's,
assimilation is to gods, not to good human beings.
right, right. Where there's of course civic virtues,
Right.
which is emulating being a good human being and
Yeah.
becoming a good human.
Modeling your behaviors on what has been said as these civic virtues. And then once you have that, take it to the next level. And what the paradigm is what we discussed earlier. Since in the intelligible world, there is no need of virtues. It is just, that is the reality. It is what it is. And to be virtuous is to try to emulate or assimilate to that, to to make
Right.
an image of that.
Right. And that will, out of necessity, also allow one to live in a state that's free from these passions and these vices. It won't even be a voluntary imposition or a voluntary choice or a
It just
decision.
is. Yeah.
It
It's
just,
the natural order of things. Yeah.
it's the natural order of things. Because
As much as like breathing is for us. We have to
right,
like consciously not breathe, but we
right.
naturally are breathing. It's just part of the paradigm of being alive as a human, such as the case for the intelligible world.
But do you think that if you achieve this, you'll alienate yourself from a lot of people in the process, because you won't have, for example, you won't have the same sort of dramatic impulses that are normal
Yeah, I think so. And I
society.
think we were talking about it last time. I don't remember if it was in this or if it was in Plato, where to be more like a philosopher, because that's kind of, you have to kind of start off from a point of being more like a philosopher or being a philosopher to even get here. The more you become a philosopher, the more, as we described last time, when you become eccentric to society, you're alienating yourself from the material realm, from all that is not good for you. So if other people are still living in a state of impulse suffering in the material world and you're alienating yourself from it, so be it, I guess. I think that's kind of the purpose, but you're also not alienating yourself to the degree. I think the other people, the world feels alienated from you. But I think as a person, if you truly reach this level, as we discussed last time, if you truly become aware of the true nature of reality and the oneness of it, as we discussed last time, there would be more empathy, and you start seeing the intelligible, the soul, the one in everyone else, and not paying attention to all the other stuff and not interacting with it either. The negative material stuff, all that falls away to you, and all you see is how we are all kind of the same stuff emanating down.
Right,
So
right,
I think I think more it creates a situation where if you're truly reaching this ascended level.
right. And I think this is the case because the less reactionary you are to people emotionally,
Well, it's
then
no longer relevant to you, right?
it's no longer relevant to you.
As you become closer and closer to that paradigm, it's like a non-issue. It's a moot point.
It is, yeah. No, I agree. It becomes a non-issue, but I guess it's just something one would have to anticipate as well, that it's not actually a how do you say, negative outcome or a symptom of a
Right,
problem.
exactly. It's not a bad thing. But I think if
Right.
one were to really follow this and get to the point that they would be able to even start actually becoming that way, they would have already realized and understood, I would hope,
Right.
that this is not a bad thing, because it's intrinsic to the point of his whole philosophy.
Right. I guess one could make the charge, though, is that if you achieve this ascended state, then you become desensitized to other people, and then you won't engage in, what would be nowadays called, like, healthy human behaviors. Like, for example,
I don't think that's
it's like
necessarily true.
a lot of modern people would say that it's healthy to express your anger in a
It
healthy
is.
way.
But we're describing a situation where you no longer even have anger, which is different than repressing your anger.
Right, right. That's what I'm getting at too,
Well,
because
I think as long as it's not a matter of, so like I personally think a lot of actual practice of stoicism, in reality, when people think they're practicing it, they're really just repressing a lot of things,
mhm,
whether or not that's actually the intent.
right.
And I guess you could do that in this case too, but I think it's framed and he words things in such a way that it's different than in stoicism, how it reads. And I think the differentiation that now, if other people in society don't understand, that's on them, whatever, who cares? Yeah,
Mhm.
they would say, like, oh, you're not expressing your anger, but it's not that I'm not expressing my anger. There is no anger to express. If you are able to eclipse anger and suffering, that's the point. Now, it makes other people uncomfortable because people are uncomfortable with that which is different from them. But again, that is their problem. And I don't think that it keeps you from being able to interact or be empathetic or still, interact with society, because there are good things in society. There are the reflections of the beauty in society. And there's no reason why you can't interact with others and be a good friend, a good family member, be loving and empathetic and supportive of others. I don't see how
Right.
being like this at all changes that.
I draw a simile with that of the physician, that if you're a physician, you're not really doing your patients any favors by being overly dramatic, prone to anger, or even sobbing, for example. Like if you're
Absolutely.
when the surgeon is performing a surgery, it's not going to help the patient if they're sobbing over the suffering of the patient. They have to be very steady and firm in
Oh,
their
yeah.
actions, and
So, and
also honest with the patient as well. Yeah.
a good friend or a good advisor, someone who is helpful in your life and loyal, they don't need to be having these emotional reactions like this. It is just human nature often for people to be wary of that because they may associate it with things like, I don't know, forms of psychopathy or other things that where people are unemotional completely. And there are people who are unemotional for and they didn't get to it in a good way.
Right.
But it exists in the material realm. It's either some sort of like neurological thing going on, chemical thing going on, or repression of emotions. But
Right.
I think that becomes, if you're the other person, like that becomes pretty clear over a short period of time what is going on with the person you're dealing with, because people who are just free of free or pretty free from being controlled by their emotions don't lack those positive aspects of humanity, such as empathy and caring, and they will give that to you. They're just
Right.
not going to get. Whereas the person who's just repressing themselves are usually dysfunctional, and it just becomes unproductive.
Right. Right. I agree. Right. And it's right. It's a difference between having a sort of, what do you say, like sociopathic or psychotic problem versus
Or narcissism, yeah.
or narcissism, and just actually being freed from a lot of vices and passions.
Right.
Where, like, I mean, I see it that if you, from a Buddhist point of view, for example, a Mahayana Buddhist point of view, for example, that in the absence of the kleshas, which we often translate as afflictive emotions, such as anger and jealousy and strong desire, that sort of thing, then you're actually just naturally a very amicable being, and then you're
Right,
just
because what did you say they were called?
afflictive emotions,
Yeah, but what was the word?
klesha.
Klesha?
Yeah, this is from Sanskrit.
Right. So, but the way you described it is the afflictive emotions, right? It doesn't, at least unless I'm misunderstanding, it's not denying all emotions or all
Yeah,
behaviors.
so the bodhisattva is actually filled with great compassion and joy. In fact,
Exactly.
the
That is
scriptures always
exactly my
say
point.
the scriptures always say that the bodhisattva has like great joy, like, oh, I'm overjoyed to the fact that I can help other beings. And so the idea is that once you eliminate these afflictive
Exactly.
emotions, then the compassion naturally arises. Also because in this context, there's no division, like epistemological distinction that you draw between yourself and others, because you
I
just
think
see
that is also true in Plotinus's
right, there's a
metaphysics.
oneness there, and so the
Yes.
natural outcome of that is spontaneous compassion for other
And once you
beings.
remove all the afflictions, or as you said, the afflictions, but all the negative impulsive emotions, and you are left only with the intelligible realm of what he has described of that to begin with, is literally, it's called the good.
Right, the good.
So
Right.
how could it be anything but a positive state of mind in which you probably are joyous and empathetic and all those good things? People's issues with that is wholly coming from their own problems with themselves. So I see it as a non-problem. Just like, people are really miserable, hate it when they see people who succeed or are happy. I think it's kind of like, that's more of an extreme example, but I think people's discomfort around seeing people who are not exhibiting anger and misery, it's coming from a similar place. It's really their problem.
Right, and then you end up with sort of provocative tendencies where they're trying to test them and see, well,
Yes.
are you really as reserved and as
Because it's a reflection upon them and their own suffering, and
right,
they don't like it.
right. These are obviously
And their own
things
shortcoming, or
right.
what they perceive as a shortcoming.
Right. Well, I mean, there's I forget who said it, but there's a Greek saying that virtue is contagious. So that also means that the opposite of virtue, vices, are also contagious as well. You are who you hang around with as well.
Absolutely.
So if you associate yourself regularly with people who are, full of vices and anger and hatred and so forth, that tends to rub off on you. Although, again, I'm kind of thinking of these Ming Dynasty Chinese writers from the 14th to 17th centuries that I've been reading recently, and they point out that you're actually a stronger person if you can actually engage with this turbulent reality where people are scheming for power and money and positions and so forth, but not be affected by it. So if you completely remove yourself physically and mentally from that world, you won't be stained by it, but you're actually a stronger and better person if you can step into it but not be stained by it.
I think Cicero also said something similar. He said, be in society, but be not of it.
Right. Yeah, I mean that's a good idea. That's a good way to frame it, right? Where you're not afflicted or infected by the same.
But it's but it's much easier to just go and be a hermit. If you're not going to interact with it, then there is no temptation of. But if you're strong enough in yourself and your identity, you can be in that without it being an issue. Much like the saying of the strength of a ship is not seen when the seas are calm.
Right.
It's in the midst of a storm.
Right. Smooth seas never made a strong sailor.
Correct.
Right.
But also, going back to your original, sorry, one more point. But that does not discount what you said to begin with, which is in a person's formative years or in your formation, it is good to choose people that are better than people who are full of vice, to be able to be the person that then can go out and interact in the world with all varieties of people and still maintain yourself and maintain virtue.
Right. That's a good point. Don't think that just presenting yourself as being sagely.
You have to become strong.
You have to. You already have. Yeah. You have to already have gone through the experiences and also.
And if you realize this later in life and didn't have the opportunity when you were young, it's never too late to change. I've made changes in my life with the kind of people I've associated with, and not that it had to be anything extreme, but definitely what you say. If there's certain kinds of people that is this bringing anything productive to me? Is this if it's not, get out of your life.
Well, it's also if you're not in a position to troubleshoot for other people as well, then you can also easily end up as a sort of like doormat for people as well.
Yes.
Kind of also as an emotional sponge where people will just lay out all of their problems. You try to troubleshoot, but it doesn't get anywhere. So you're basically just a receptacle for all of their concerns, but they're not really working with you.
Because they are not seeking. Because the person themselves has to be seeking the better people to be better. You can't try to impose it upon them. So you should always be seeking what is better.
Right. And it's also recognize one's own shortcomings and constantly be aware of, all light.
But you can only realize anything if you're not when it's imposed upon you or people try to, but when you are the one actively choosing to seek.
Right. So, the conscious decision, and this is, I think, what Plotinus is saying, that once you made this conscious decision, then you can gradually work towards this process of purification to the point that there's not even like a conscious the desire for it or a conscious orientation toward purification. It's just there.
Yep.
And that's the ideal outcome to this. Okay, well, we should wrap it up here, and we'll see everybody on the next show. Take care.
Bye-bye.